Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I'd like to thank Angela, Andreas, Saskia, and everyone else that's part of the conference organizers. It's difficult as the rear guard, I think, to say the least. Many great presentations today by many brilliant scholars, so I'll try my best. All right. So I'm here today to talk about how titles on the title pages of early English printed plays or playbooks were arranged, what information they divulged, and how their verbiage and structuring changed across the 16th and 17th centuries. 4 main points will guide my presentation. First, the number of words used in titles of single edition playbooks declined steadily and significantly from the 1590s to the 1660s, moving from a diverse primordial soup-like assortment of titles to a much more homogeneous group of titles that were more often than not uniform in all manners of appearance. Secondly, playbooks tied to this decline in title length generally took on only one of 2 title formats, which means that dramatic titles not only evolved to resemble each other, they also became much more distinct and recognizable. Thirdly, both professional and non-professional playbooks were affected by this trend, but in the aggregate, professional playbook titles were impacted to a greater degree. And finally, while folio collections containing plays are often differentiated from smaller format playbooks for being more prestigious, when it specifically comes to titles, by the time the public London theatres closed in 1642, playbook titles interestingly mimic the short titles used in larger folio collections, like the works of Ben Jonson in 1616. Ultimately, by seeing dramatic titles within this larger context of title shortening and through the perspective of bookselling stationers, we can unlock new inroads into how printed drama factored into the process and experience of early modern book buying. Before proceeding, it may be helpful to clarify what is meant by and constitutes a playbook title. The early modern dramatic title page is generally demarcated into the following distinct textual components, or peritexts as Gerard Genet puts it, in order of their usual appearance from top to bottom. Title, authorial attribution, sometimes with editorial pledges, record of performance and or play company attribution, and the imprint, though it should be noted that some of these components other than the title were occasionally omitted. The OED defines title as, quote, the name of a book, poem, or other piece of writing, which in the context of early English drama should mean exclusively the name of the play and any of its inner creative details given first in order on the printed title page. The primary focus of this presentation, therefore, lies solely in these full-length names and any accompanying details of the play. To start simply, the title page is a house of general information. It should, at the very least, inform readers the basics of the underlying text beneath its leaf. Title pages convey key pieces of intelligence so passers-by can decide whether or not to seek out a book, to peruse it, and if all goes well, possibly purchase it. Title pages by design are meant to guide, but they can also take measures to distinguish themselves even more, to self-identify genre, to set themselves apart from other title pages competing for attention. This was something that had to have been given consideration by publishers and booksellers since title pages were used as standalone advertisements around London. In what was referred to as, quote, a confused world of trumpery by lawyer-poet John Davies, title pages were in such abundance all over public places in London that they figuratively swarmed passers-by on the streets. As Tiffany Stern and others have noted, title pages really were posted everywhere. Hard surfaces were exposed. London was indeed, quote, covered in texts. In a fast-paced environment where, according to conduct writer Henry Cross, quote, almost every post gives knowledge of a new toy, which many times intercepts the virtuous disposition of a willing buyer, readers formed first impressions quickly, and stationers had to make reasonable efforts to draw attention to their inventories to set themselves up for success. If a drama-dealing bookseller desired to pull potential readers at first glance, a logical place to turn to and tinker with was the spearhead of the title page, the title. If the title page, as I've laid out, is a guide to the playbook's material conditions, then the title, being the principal and typographically largest component, is like a snapshot or a series of snapshots of its unseen creative substance. It is worth bearing in mind that title pages were not only posted throughout London, They were also sometimes assembled together in a collage-like fashion in the shop fronts of bookshops on stalls, which means that booksellers likely had to think of ways to formulate effective playbook titles that somewhat accurately represented the gist of the corresponding play, while at the same time self-promoting to onlookers. This was undoubtedly a trial and error process that resulted in a few tried and true conventions slowly cementing. It involved imitating the titling practices of predecessors, masters, associates, collaborators, competitors, as well as staying informed about the ways in which titles of contemporaneously published books were being presented to the public. We can perhaps see this experimentation taking place in the two titles of Edward II from 1594 and 1598. Despite the right to copy not changing hands, bookseller William Jones decided to add a descriptive subtitle to the second quarto of Edward II. An attention-seeking tactic that furnished the title page with extra details for readers to go off of? Yes, but this may have also been done to copy or match the titles of other history playbooks that tended to peacock lengthy description-like titles, and this was actually a fashionable, short-lived trend in the 1590s. To return to my previous point, if a bookseller was intent on creating long-lasting readerships and repeat customers, then some degree of care must have been invested into tinkering with and optimizing titles in order to communicate a perception of saleability and consistency and instill a sense of trustworthiness. To get a reading for how playbook titles were arranged on the title page and how verbiage changed over time, please excuse the pun, take a page out of digital humanities scholar Franco Moretti's Distant Reading Playbook. Here is a bird's eye view of title length, or the number of words used in playbook titles in all single edition adult drama, so usually quarto, but occasionally octavo and duodecimo. From 1590, when professional adult drama came to be published with more frequency, to the Restoration in 1660. Each dot represents the title of a printed play. Its placement in the scatterplot is dictated by length on the y-axis and year it was published on the x-axis. Just from a visual inspection, we can clearly see the aforementioned general trend of title shortening. The denser clustering of titles from around 1630 to 1640 reinforced this notion that more and more titles were cropping up with less words. A linear trend line giving us the best fit straight line trajectory is further evidence of this steep decline. Furthermore, a different kind of trend line, a Loess or locally estimated scatterplot smoothing curve, is yet another indication that across 7 decades, titles progressively gravitate towards a compressed form. Put simply, the late stage of dramatic title evolution appears to have been one of contraction, simplification, and pithiness. However, this kind of map that accounts for every single published playbook inadvertently creates some limitations. In actuality, examining both new and reprinted titles alongside each other obscures our understanding of how playbook titles adopted certain permutations over multiple decades. Considering that reprinted titles, or what I mean here is the titles of reprinted editions, rarely change from edition to edition, not filtering out duplicate titles is an obstruction to our view of how brand new titles being introduced to the London book trade evolved across the early modern period. Moving along, moreover, the most reprinted playbooks, or early English drama's bestsellers, tend to hail from the late Elizabethan and early Jacobean eras and generally have much longer titles. As data points then, their inclusion would further blur long-term changes in title length should they be examined side by side with first edition titles. So if we want to apprehend why stationers made innovations to the ways in which they formatted and marketed in print the names of their new dramatic investments, we must turn to first edition titles in isolation. If we hide multi-edition titles from the data, a clearer picture and more defined pattern of playbook title length emerges. It turns out that not all playbook titles shorten and simplify, because we know most titles do not change from first to second edition, second to third, and so on. Rather, it is that newly published first edition titles increasingly crop up with shorter and shorter titles to the point where succinctness is gradually adopted to become the new market-wide paradigm for the vast majority of new playbooks. In other words, from around the 1590s to the 1630s and into the 1640s, stationers curiously elected to deploy shorter titles, even though most reprinted and therefore more reliably profitable playbooks tended to have longer titles. This is somewhat unusual considering that publishers and booksellers, according to Zachary Lesser, quote, would often evaluate each potential publication based on the previous ones. If a book succeeded, whether as a result of deliberate marketing strategies or not, a publisher would likely choose another of the same kind. So despite longer titled playbooks selling more copies and editions in the aggregate, which was something stationers must have been cognizant of, this titling strategy was not imitated, and instead it was gradually abandoned after the turn of the 16th century. And this applied to most printed drama. For if we turn to non-professional plays, so Inns of Court drama, university plays, Latin plays, closet plays, masks, pageants, etc., we see a similar declining trend. Though not as pronounced and sharp, non-professional titles too settle into a shorter title paradigm. As with professional plays, we see the same variety of title length up until a certain point, decline in words used gains traction after this point, and it appears as though a short title convention is firmly in place by the 1630s. This is further illustrated by another bar graph illustrating average title length by decade. For professional playbooks, the 30s and 40s compared to the 1590s sees a remarkable 64 to 76% decrease in words used. The trend is unmistakable. The evolutionary path of single edition playbook titles is one of downsizing, simplification, and therefore, as we will see shortly, a homogenization. There are three specific things to note and home in on now that our aerial view of title length is exclusive to first edition playbooks. And here, moving forward, I focus on professional plays since the trend is most prominent in this category. One, a group of medium to long titles only exists with regular frequency until roughly 1615. Two, there is a transitional period of sorts from 1615 to 1625. And three, again, though much more defined now, by roughly 1629, there is an established convention in place that holds sway over how new playbook titles should be extremely brief in nature, usually under 10 words. The proliferation of such varying title lengths between 1590 and 1615, I believe, indicates an instability in presentational protocol, which is to say, there are yet to be any set-in-stone conventions or agreed-upon procedures when it came to the naming of plays on title pages. Since the regular publication of medium to long titles is unique to this time frame and becomes a rarity soon after, let us briefly examine what stationers were attempting to achieve by using this particular strategy before moving on to shorter titles and what they afforded both stationers and readers. As a rule of thumb, longer titles consist of one, what I call a core title that establishes the main subject of the play. And this is sometimes accompanied by a generic marker. And two, several subtitles that read like descriptions or narratives, containing truncated plot points and highlights in the play's action, and occasionally a sales pitch for the edifying value gained from reading the playbook. Whether that was true or not is to be debated. We see this style in the longest titled early modern plays, such as The Arden of Faversham and The Three Ladies of London, depicted here. They are conspicuously similar in nature to earlier non-professional titles from the 1560s and 1570s, the precursors to public professional drama and therefore natural predecessors for booksellers to look to draw from for their title presentations. Here are two examples. Note the semblance in verbiage, the excessive use of subtitles or descriptions, and the typographical layout in what Margaret M. Smith calls the half-diamond indentation style. By generating extended titles with expository details and some advertising, stationers effectively created a selective preview or mini-narrative of the playbook. For readers unaccustomed to drama in print in the 1590s, longer titles perhaps acted as guides or training wheels in the browsing, perusal, and buying processes. Several booksellers, in fact, trialed this longer strategy in the 1590s. Take, for instance, bookseller Andrew Wise's treatment of Richard II and Richard III in 1597, both of which were entered by Wise in the Stationer's Register in the second half of 1597. Despite the title pages of both first quartos, quote, exhibiting regularity and uniformity in their presentation, suggesting these plays are part of a considered strategy, according to Amy Lidster, Wise's very first Shakespearean investments were printed in two different styles for the same London readerships. Richard II's strategy involved a minimal short title, the generic marker, 7 words. Richard III supplemented the same kind of short title with explicit plot elements, in extended subtitles, 37 words. And I mentioned earlier bookseller William Jones and his expansion of Edward II's title in 1598 after 4 years after the first quarto. Indeed, there was reliance on preceding title formats or even a kind of herd behavior at work when it came to these longer professional playbook titles, and yet by 1615, this trial is abandoned as subtitles containing dense descriptions fall out of fashion. Between 1615 and 1625, the most notable publications in the domain of drama were, of course, the Ben Jonson and William Shakespeare first folios in 1616 and 1623, respectively. These two larger books are often treated differently from their single quarto counterparts for being printed in a larger format that was usually reserved for important works. However, I want to advance the notion that the titles, particularly in the Jonson folio, had significant sway in the arrangement and verbiage of subsequently published single edition playbook titles by popularizing two specific title formats. The works takes after previously published single author and dramatic collections of George Gascoigne, William Alexander, and Samuel Daniel by deploying a catalog or table of contents in the front matter, a recreated title page or mock title page, and short title headings preceding each play. The catalog is straightforward in listing the truncated titles of all plays in the collection as well as the non-dramatic material. The recreated title page before each play text annexed the truncated titles with generic markers, thus forcefully establishing a sense of uniformity and continuity across the entire dramatic subsection. The two shorter title formats used in the works, which I call core title and core title genre, eventually become the dominant modes in which brand new dramatic titles are presented. The latter format, so core title genre, in exact replication is also curiously absent in professional playbooks before 1616. Only around 3 out of a total of 110 first edition playbook titles before 1616 are structured in a format resembling Jonson's core title genre format. Although about half of these 110 titles mention genre in some way, aside from these 3 outliers, generic designations always appear at the beginning of titles. In other words, roughly before 1616, the convention was that genre was almost never to appear at the end of the title for some reason. The even more boiled down core title format, devoid of any subtitles, is also somewhat uncommon in the decades preceding 1616. 23 first edition titles deploy genreless core title formats. This accounts for roughly 21% of the 107 first edition titles published between 1590 and 1615, or 1 in 5 first edition playbooks. In sum, in pre-1616 first edition playbooks, Jonson's popularized core title format is a tad uncommon, and the core title genre format is nearly non-existent. After 1616, however, there is a permanent change. While the core title format maintains its frequency and appearance, the core title genre format explodes. Part of the playbook title's story here involves not just severe contraction via the loss of descriptive subtitles, but also the replacement of subtitles with referencing to and careful placement of generic classification. After 1616, and really by 1630, a new paradigm for playbook titling is ushered in, as 88% of first edition titles after this year use 10 words or less, and 79% use either the core title or core title genre formats popularized by Jonson's works, and really the 58% figure of the core title genre format is, I think, stands out. Compared to the decades preceding the Jonson folio, when shorter titles using these two formats was only present in 1 out of 5 new playbooks, this is a noteworthy turnaround in trends. A panorama of first edition titles color-coded to format type demonstrates both the proliferation of these specific formats and the fact that they were the predominant and default conventions used by stationers when naming their new plays on title pages from the 1620s and 1630s into the Civil War, when theaters were closed, all the way up to the Restoration in 1660. And here, I apologize for the confusing nature of this. It is top down, left, right, and 1616 is right around here. You can see all the color sort of coming through right after 1616, and it being a bit absent in the years preceding 1616. As I come to my conclusion, I'd like to query, why the move to minimal titles? What was the rationale behind a less telling, more showing approach to title presentation? What would passersby and readers have gained from seeing these bare bones title arrangements in the streets, in shop fronts, in their own collections and bundles? The preference for and programmatic usage of matter-of-fact layout to title playbooks sans the expository subtitles perhaps encourage readers to inquire for or pick up a playbook rather than assess a preview of it. Philip Tromans has recently shown that pre-purchase pleas and promotions addressed to the perusing buyer exist in dozens of early modern books. And the implication here is that if authors and stationers wrote these adverts with browsing customers in mind, then handheld reader engagement with the book was to be expected, such as flipping through past the title page to get to front matter. Shorter playbook titles may have figured into such a practice at the bookshop by deliberately being discreet to induce perusal. Lastly, with the dramatic title formats in Johnson's works being emulated post-1616 on title pages of first edition playbooks, there are perhaps new horizons and opportunities for readers to assemble their own non-collections or Sammelband of contemporary plays, with the added bonus of their front-facing paratexts looking more similar to each other, perhaps giving off a folio-like arrangement and feel. We might see something like this at work if we look at John Stone's recent discovery of 2 uncatalogued early English playbook bundles from the 1630s at the Royal Scots College of Salamanca in Spain. This is the uncatalogued bundle in order from left to right, top to bottom. And this is the tragedy bundle. Note the consistency in title, or general consistency in title presentation, an overall cleaner look, and the added uniformity across this user-created collection, afforded by mostly short titles of similar lengths. The perspicuous but less revealing nature of these newly condensed titles perhaps not only encouraged perusal, but also encouraged bundling and made the bundled end product more aesthetically pleasing for the user. And thus concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time.